Hey everyone, Sky here to discuss The Mummy, the 1959 version, starring Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Yvonne Furneaux, and Eddie Byrne, and directed by Terence Fisher. Now, I'm just going to let you guys know one thing before I get into this review. I'm not doing this one sequels, because it'll probably take a long time for me to understand what is happening. I just want to get straight to the Brendan Fraser one, honestly. I guess that's my professional opinion. But let's get into the movie. Archaeologist Stephen and his son John Banning, played by Peter Cushing, find a fossil in 1895 as Stephen goes in the tomb of the mummy while John has a broken leg and resting up, and Mehmet Bey warns Stephen and Joseph Wemple to not do so but Stephen, Joseph, and Mehmet Bey are not as interesting as characters as John, who I can relate to because in the future he will be in one of my all-time favorite films, Star Wars, A New Hope. And I related to him as a villain more than a hero in this movie, but I still liked his character, but not as much as in Star Wars. Stephen is comatose, and 3 years later, in 1898, as he's in a mental hospital and he's improving, and Stephen remembers nothing about John except his broken leg, and he's brought a mummy back to life, and it will be released again that year, and I'm thinking he's dead at this point. It was so telegraphed it wasn't very funny. Stephen is agitated about the mummy to the point he smashes a window as the horse cart pass, and my God, was that hysterical. The doctor tells John that Stephen needs to be restrained because of his agitating. Mehmet Bey resurrects the mummy, played by Christopher Lee, who I love as an actor from this to Lord of the Rings to the Star Wars prequels. Bey instructs the mummy to find and kill the people who desecrated the tomb, and taking vengeance against the starting with Stephen at the mental hospital, and I knew that was coming to the point it was predictable. John and Joseph discuss the discovery of Princess Ananka, who we get a flashback of how the mummy was in love with the princess, and how he became a mummy and buried alive to the next to the princess. And I sort of started losing interest at this point, because the movie's just, I can't take it. The mummy bursts into John's house and strangles Joseph, and shoots the mummy a few times, and it leaves to no effect, as makes sense, because it's already dead. Then Inspector Mulrooney, played by Eddie Byrne, talks with John and doesn't believe he hit the mummy with bullets, and that was very laughable. And Mehmet Bey puts the mummy back into its burial chamber, as I get the impression the mummy is a prisoner, and Mehmet Bey is the guard. And how many times do we need that in a mummy movie? It's beginning to look a lot like a cliche. At the house, John notices that his wife Isabel, played by Yvonne Furneaux, looking attractive as he brings up the mummy, wanting to kill him, and he also wants her to be safe, as he gets a shotgun and ready as the mummy makes its way to the house and breaks the window to get in the house and strangles him until Isabel comes in, and the mummy thinks of her as Princess Ananka and walks away. And I thought the score that in that scene made me roll my eyes, as it's a stupid way for a monster to go, because how many more times am I going to see that? And the Brendan Fraser one is executed much better than here. I'll be reviewing that next week. John goes to Mehmet Bey's house to talk about the Egyptians' culture to find where the mummy is, and John should know he's lying like it's so obvious. Then Mehmet Bey promises that John will be dead before sunrise, but I wasn't buying it as he's so dead by the end of this movie. John returns home as Isabel Mulroney prepared the arrival of the mummy with loaded guns, and Bay and the mummy approach through the woods, and they attack the poocher, the policeman, and knock Mulroney unconscious, and then he attacks John as he shoots him twice before the mummy starts strangling him. Isabel comes in and tells the mummy to stop, and she puts her hair down as it closely resembles Princess Ananka. Bay orders the mummy to kill her, but instead attacks Bay, and she faints, and the mummy takes Isabel to the bog as John follows, and she asks the mummy to put her down, and once the mummy does, the men shoot the mummy as the mummy sinks, and I don't care for this climax. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 4.5 out of 10. Not as fine as the Boris Karloff film, but I do like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee in this movie. But overall, I didn't care for the film as well as it was predictable and unnecessary to add this to the series. And as I'm going to do this, not going to do this one sequels because it's not necessary. So I would like to thank you guys for joining me, and next week I will be back with the Brendan Fraser Mummy. And until next time, it's time to shoot the mummy.